Hi, I'm Riley. I thought serving my country meant earning respect, honor, and the unwavering support of my family. Instead, after 3 tours in Afghanistan, my own relatives called me a liar, questioned my service, and accused me of stolen valor at their packed sports bar in front of the entire town of Millbrook. They didn't believe the quiet daughter who left for basic training could possibly be the decorated sergeant who came home. Big mistake, because what they didn't know was that my entire unit was planning a reunion just 50 miles away, and they were about to get a very public lesson in what real military brotherhood looks like. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Because sometimes the family you're born into forgets who you really are, but the family you choose in the trenches never will. The autumn air in Millbrook, Tennessee carried that familiar bite of October, the kind that makes you pull your jacket closer and reminds you that winter isn't far behind. I'd been back home for 6 months now, trying to readjust to civilian life after my third and final deployment. The transition wasn't easy. It never is. Going from the adrenaline and purpose of military operations to the quiet, predictable rhythm of small-town life felt like learning to breathe underwater. I pulled into the gravel parking lot of Donovan's Bar and Grill, the family business that had been the heart of our town for over 20 years. My stepfather, Frank Donovan, had built this place from nothing after marrying my mother when I was 12. Back then, he'd been kind to me, patient with a grieving kid who'd lost her biological father too young. The bar had been our family's pride, the place where everyone in Millbrook came to celebrate victories, mourn losses, and argue about high school football over cold beer and Frank's famous wings. But something had shifted during my years away. Maybe it was the time and distance, or maybe it was the fact that the quiet, bookish girl they remembered bore little resemblance to the confident soldier who'd returned. Either way, the warmth I'd once felt from this place had been replaced by something colder, more skeptical. As I pushed through the heavy wooden doors, the familiar smell of beer, fried food, and cigarette smoke from the designated smoking section hit me. The walls were covered with local memorabilia, high school football photos, pictures of town festivals, and a small section dedicated to local veterans from previous wars. Notably absent were any photos of me in uniform, despite my mother's promises to put something up when you get back. The dinner rush was in full swing. Servers weaved between tables packed with families, couples on date nights, and groups of friends unwinding after long workdays. The sounds of conversation, clinking glasses, and the constant drone of sports commentary from multiple TVs created that familiar bar atmosphere that should have felt like home. Frank stood behind the bar, his graying hair slicked back, sleeves rolled up as he pulled draft beers with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing it for decades. My mother, Diane, bustled between tables with order pads and forced smiles, her blonde hair pulled back in the same tight ponytail she'd worn for as long as I can remember. My younger brother, Jesse, worked the kitchen, occasionally peeking out to deliver plates with the surly expression of a 22-year-old who felt trapped in a small town. They all looked up when I entered, but the acknowledgement was brief, perfunctory. A nod from Frank, a distracted wave from Diane as she balanced 3 plates on her arms. Complete indifference from Jesse. I might as well have been any other customer walking in for dinner. I found a seat at the far end of the bar, away from the clusters of regulars who dominated the prime real estate closer to the TVs. Frank eventually made his way over, wiping his hands on a bar towel with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested he wasn't in any hurry to engage. "What can I get you?" he asked, his tone professionally polite but lacking any familial warmth. "Just a beer, whatever's on tap," I replied, matching his distant energy. As he pulled the beer, I noticed him glance at my jacket, a simple black military-style jacket with my unit patches still attached. It was unusual for veterans to wear their old gear, but something about his expression suggested he found it noteworthy for all the wrong reasons. He slid the beer across the bar with a little more force than necessary. "That'll be $4.50. I handed him a five, telling him to keep the change, and settled in to drink alone while my family worked around me like I was invisible. This had become the routine over the past few months. I'd stop by, hoping for some connection, some acknowledgement of who I'd become during my time away, and instead I'd get the cold shoulder from people who seemed to view my military service as either irrelevant or increasingly suspicious. The first hint of real trouble had come about a month earlier, when I'd mentioned receiving my Bronze Star to Diane during one of our stilted conversations. Instead of pride or congratulation, I'd seen something flicker across her face. Doubt, maybe even suspicion. She'd made some comment about all those medals they give out nowadays, and changed the subject so quickly I wondered if I'd imagined the whole exchange. But I hadn't imagined it. Over the following weeks, I'd caught fragments of whispered conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. Glances between Frank and Diane that seemed loaded with meaning I wasn't privy to. Jesse's increasingly sarcastic comments about war heroes whenever military service came up in conversation, his eyes finding mine with a challenge I didn't understand. The truth was, I'd changed during my time away. The scared, uncertain 18-year-old who'd enlisted partially to escape the suffocating smallness of Millbrook had been forged into someone different through training, deployment, and the crucible of actual combat. I'd led soldiers through dangerous missions, made life-and-death decisions under pressure, and earned the respect of people who knew what real courage looked like. But somehow, in the eyes of the people who'd known me longest, those achievements were suspect. Too impressive for the girl they remembered, too dramatic for someone from their quiet little world. Sitting at that bar, nursing my beer, while my family treated me like a stranger, I felt the familiar ache of disconnection that had plagued me since returning home. The people I'd served with would have understood. They knew what it meant to carry the weight of responsibility, to make impossible choices, to come home carrying experiences that couldn't be easily translated into civilian conversation. But they were scattered across the country now, pursuing their own post-military lives, while I was stuck trying to rebuild relationships with people who seemed determined to keep me at arm's length. I finished my beer in silence, left a tip on the bar, and walked out into the cool evening air without saying goodbye to anyone. Behind me, the warm glow of Donovan's Bar and Grill spilled onto the parking lot, full of laughter and conversation that I wasn't part of. As I drove home to my small apartment across town, I had no idea that the real confrontation was still weeks away, or that my family's doubts about my service were about to explode into something much more public and painful than I could have imagined. The weeks that followed settled into a predictable rhythm of awkward family interactions and small-town isolation. Millbrook in late October was a picture-perfect snapshot of rural Tennessee. Maple trees blazing orange and red along Main Street, pumpkins decorating every storefront, and that crisp mountain air that made everything feel sharper, more defined. It should have been comforting, this return to the place that raised me, but instead it felt like trying to fit into clothes that no longer matched who I'd become. My daily routine had become depressingly simple. Morning runs through the quiet neighborhoods where I'd grown up, trying to burn off the restless energy that civilian life couldn't seem to absorb. Afternoons spent job hunting, scrolling through listings for positions that either required skills I didn't have or paid wages that barely covered rent. Evenings alone in my cramped apartment above Henderson's hardware store, watching Netflix and video calling with former unit members who were scattered across the country, all struggling with their own versions of the same adjustment challenges. The apartment itself was a far cry from the barracks I'd called home for the better part of 6 years. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who owned the building, had been kind enough to rent to me month to month while I figured out my next steps. The space was small but clean, a studio with barely enough room for a bed, a tiny kitchenette, and a desk where I worked on my endless job applications. The walls were thin enough that I could hear every conversation from the hardware store below, every customer complaining about broken lawnmowers or searching for the right size screws for their weekend projects.
It was during one of these quiet afternoons that I first noticed how the conversations downstairs sometimes stopped when customers mentioned my name. Millbrook was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and apparently my return had become a topic of local speculation. That's Frank Donovan's stepdaughter, isn't it? The one who says she was in the war. Says she was, came the carefully neutral reply. Course, these days, a lot of people claim all sorts of things. The doubt in their voices was subtle but indistinguishable, and it echoed the same skepticism I'd been sensing from my family. In a town where the biggest excitement was usually the annual corn festival or a high school football playoff game, the idea that quiet Riley Mitchum had somehow become a decorated combat veteran seemed to strain credibility. My relationship with Frank had grown increasingly strange since my return. The man who'd once taught me to change oil and helped with my high school math homework now treated me with a polite distance that felt more painful than outright hostility. During my occasional visits to the bar, I'd catch him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not anger exactly, but something closer to disappointment mixed with suspicion.
Diane, my mother, had taken a different approach. She'd become aggressively cheerful in my presence, filling every conversation with meaningless chatter about town gossip, weather, and the bar's business. It was as if she'd decided that by avoiding any mention of my military service, she could pretend the tension didn't exist. When forced to acknowledge my time away, she'd use phrases like, "your time in the service," with the same tone other people might use to describe a difficult phase someone was going through. Jesse, my younger brother, had always been the family contrarian, but his attitude toward me had developed a sharp edge that felt personal. He'd graduated high school while I was on my second deployment and had spent the past few years bouncing between community college classes and shifts at the bar, never quite settling on a direction. My return seemed to highlight his own lack of accomplishment, and he'd developed a habit of making snide comments about heroes and people who think they're better than everyone else. The physical reminders of my service were scattered throughout my small apartment like artifacts from another life. My dress uniform hung in the narrow closet, the ribbons and medals catching light from the single window. Photos from my deployment sat in frames on my desk. Pictures of my squad after successful missions, group shots from base camps, candid moments of soldiers finding humor in impossible circumstances. My gear bag, still packed with equipment I'd carried through 3 tours, sat in the corner like a sleeping animal. These items felt sacred to me, tangible proof of experiences that had shaped me in fundamental ways. But in the context of Millbrook, surrounded by people who seemed to view them with skepticism, they began to feel like evidence in a case I didn't know I was defending. The town itself had changed very little during my absence. Bryson's Diner still served the same greasy breakfast that had sustained generations of local workers. The courthouse square still hosted the weekly farmers market where Mrs. Johnson sold the same varieties of apples she'd been growing for 30 years. The old movie theater on Main Street had finally closed, its marquee dark and letters missing, but everything else remained frozen in the familiar amber of small-town consistency. What had changed was my place in it. Before my enlistment, I'd been Frank's stepdaughter, Diane's quiet kid, Jesse's bookish older sister. People had known me in the casual way that small towns know their own, but I'd never been particularly notable. I'd been a decent student, kept out of trouble, worked part-time shifts at the bar during high school, and generally fulfilled the role of a nice, unremarkable girl who would probably stay local, marry someone from town, and settle into the predictable patterns that defined life in Millbrook. My return had disrupted that narrative. The confident woman who'd come back from deployment didn't fit neatly into the box they'd constructed for quiet Riley Mitchum. My stories of convoy operations, leadership responsibilities, and combat zones sounded too dramatic, too far removed from the reality of their daily lives to feel authentic. During my 3rd week back, I'd made the mistake of mentioning my Bronze Star during dinner at the bar.
I'd been trying to explain why I'd been delayed coming home, sharing what I thought was good news about recognition for actions during a particularly difficult mission. Instead of the pride I'd hoped to see in my family's faces, I'd been met with uncomfortable silence and exchanged glances. Bronze Star, Frank had said, his tone carefully neutral. That's quite an honor. They give those out pretty liberally now, Jesse had added, not looking up from his phone. Read an article about it, so they're basically participation trophies these days. The casual dismissal had stung more than I had expected. I tried to explain the circumstances that led to the commendation, a convoy attack where I'd organized medical evacuation under fire and coordinated defensive positions that had saved multiple lives. But their attention had already shifted to other topics. That night, lying in my narrow bed above the hardware store, I'd called my former squad leader, Sergeant First Class Martinez, who was adjusting to civilian life in Colorado. "They don't get it," she had said simply when I described the interaction. "My family's the same way. It's like they think we're making it up or exaggerating. They can't picture little Maria from the neighborhood doing the things we did." "How do you deal with it?" I'd asked. "You don't," she had replied. "You just remember that the people who matter know the truth. The rest of them can think whatever they want." But it was harder than that when the people who doubted you were the ones you'd hoped would be proudest of your accomplishments. Every awkward interaction, every skeptical glance, every casual dismissal of my service felt like a small betrayal of the person I'd worked so hard to become. As October faded toward November, the pattern had become entrenched. I was living like a ghost in my own hometown, present but not really welcome, tolerated but not celebrated. The woman who'd led soldiers through combat zones was being treated like a troubled teenager who'd finally come home.
What I didn't know was that the situation was about to get much worse. The quiet skepticism and family tension were just the opening act. The real confrontation, the moment when years of doubt and resentment would explode into something public and humiliating, was still waiting in the wings. And when it came, it would change everything. The first Thursday of November arrived with an unseasonable warmth that had the whole town talking. Veterans Day was still a week away, but Millbrook had already begun its annual preparations. Flags appeared on every storefront, the VFW started planning their modest parade route, and Donovan's Bar and Grill prepared for their traditional Veterans Day celebration, complete with discounted drinks for anyone who could show military ID. I should have stayed home that night. Every instinct I'd developed over 3 deployments was telling me to avoid the bar, to skip the family dinner that Diane had insisted on scheduling. But 6 months of isolation and careful avoidance had worn me down. Maybe it was loneliness, or maybe it was some stubborn hope that things could still be repaired between us. But I found myself walking through those familiar wooden doors just as the dinner rush was hitting its peak. The bar was packed beyond its usual capacity. Thursday night football drew the regular crowd, but tonight felt different, more festive, more energetic. Someone had strung up red, white, and blue bunting along the bar, and a handwritten sign by the register advertised Military Appreciation Night. Show your ID for 20% off. The irony wasn't lost on me as I approached the hostess station where my mother stood with her perpetual clipboard and forced smile. "Riley!" Diane's voice carried that artificially bright tone she'd perfected over the years. "I was hoping you'd make it. Frank's saving a spot at the family table." She led me through the crowded dining room toward a large corner booth where Frank sat with Jesse and several of their friends from the local VFW post. I recognized most of them. Older men who had served in Vietnam or the Gulf War, guys who came in regularly to argue about politics and reminisce about their younger days. They'd always been friendly enough to me before my enlistment, treating me like any other local kid, but tonight, their expressions ranged from politely curious to openly skeptical. "Look who decided to join us," Frank announced as I approached, his voice carrying just far enough to draw attention from nearby tables. "Our little war hero." The phrase hit me like a physical blow. There was no pride in his voice, no warmth, just a subtle mockery that made every conversation in the immediate area pause. I slid into the booth next to Jesse, who immediately shifted away from me like I carried some contagious disease.
Riley's been telling us all about her adventures overseas. Bronze Star, combat operations, the whole 9 yards. Quite impressive for someone who used to be afraid of her own shadow. Laughter rippled around the table, but it wasn't the kind of laughter that included me. It was the sound of adults indulging someone's obvious fabrication, the way you might chuckle at a child's wild story about fighting dragons. "Now, Frank," said Bill Hendrips, a Vietnam veteran who'd known me since I was little, "let's not give the girl a hard time. Military service is military service, even if it's different than what we went through." "Different how?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Bill's expression grew uncomfortable. "Well, these days they have all those support roles, logistics, communications, important work, don't get me wrong, but not exactly what we think of when we hear combat veteran." The assumption stung because it revealed exactly what they had been thinking all along. In their minds, there was no way Quiet Riley Mitchum could have been anything other than a desk clerk or supply specialist. The idea that I might have actually led soldiers in combat, might have earned my decorations through actions under fire, was simply too far outside their conception of who I was to be believable. "I wasn't in a support role," I said carefully. "I was infantry, military police with combat assignments." Jesse snorted into his beer. "Right. And I'm the Secretary of Defense." The table erupted in laughter again, louder this time. Other patrons were definitely watching now, drawn by the unusual commotion at what was normally the quiet family table. I could feel my face burning with embarrassment and growing anger, but I forced myself to remain calm. "Riley," Diane said with weak authority, "don't be rude to your sister." "Half-sister," he corrected automatically. "And I'm not being rude. I'm just saying it's a little convenient how all these war stories started after she came back. Funny how nobody heard about any of this hero stuff while she was gone." You heard about it. I sent letters. I called when I could. I told you about the missions, the deployments, You told us you were stationed in different places," Frank interrupted. "You never mentioned anything about combat or medals or leading soldiers. Now suddenly you're Rambo."
The name hung in the air like an accusation. Around the table, heads nodded in agreement. They'd clearly discussed this among themselves, had built a collective narrative that cast me as either delusional or deliberately deceptive. The worst part was that I could see their point. The girl they remembered had been quiet, bookish, more likely to hide behind a novel than charging to danger. The transformation from that person to the soldier I'd become was dramatic enough to strain credibility, especially for people who hadn't witnessed the gradual process of military training and experience that had shaped me. "I didn't talk about the danger stuff because I didn't want you to worry," I explained, hating how defensive I sounded. "When you're deployed, you learn not to share the details that would keep your family awake at night." "How convenient," muttered Tom Bradley, another VFW regular. "Can't verify any of it because it was all classified, right?" "It wasn't classified. It's documented. I can show you." "Show us what?" Frank's voice had grown louder, more aggressive. "Some papers you printed off the internet? Some photos you found online? Come on, Riley, we've known you your whole life. You think we don't know who you really are?" The question cut deeper than anything else he could have said, because the truth was, I wasn't sure they did know who I really was. They knew the child I'd been, the teenager who'd left for basic training 6 years ago, but they'd missed the transformation, the crucible of military service that had forged me into someone fundamentally different. In their minds, people didn't change that dramatically. Quiet girls stayed quiet. Bookish kids remained bookish. The idea that I could have become a leader, a warrior, someone capable of making life and death decisions under pressure, simply didn't fit their conception of human nature. "Why would I lie about something like this?" I asked, genuinely confused by their hostility. "Attention, sympathy, free drinks, respect you didn't earn. Take your pick." "Stolen valor is a real problem these days," added Bill Hendricks, his tone taking on the lecturing quality of someone delivering a public service announcement. People pretending to be something they're not, claiming honors that belong to real veterans. It's disgraceful. The accusation of stolen valor landed like a physical blow.
Around the table, heads nodded sagely, as if they'd identified the root of the problem. They weren't just doubting my stories anymore, they were accusing me of deliberately dishonoring actual military service by fabricating my own. The noise level in the restaurant had dropped noticeably. Conversations at nearby tables had stopped entirely as people strained to listen to our increasingly heated exchange. I could see servers hovering uncertainly, unsure whether to intervene in what was clearly a family dispute that was spiraling out of control. "I have documentation," I said again, louder this time. "DD 114, unit records, citation orders, I can prove everything I've told you." "Documents can be faked," Frank said dismissively. "These days you can forge anything with a computer and a printer. Hell, there are probably websites that'll sell you fake military records." "Why don't you believe me?" The question came out more plaintive than I intended, carrying all the hurt and confusion I'd been suppressing for months. Frank leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow carried further than his previous shouting. "Because we know you, Riley. We raised you. You were scared of everything. Thunderstorms, horror movies, arguing with teachers. You cried when we had to put down the neighbor's cat. You think we're going to believe that same girl turned into some kind of action hero? That she's out there fighting terrorists and saving lives? Come on." The table fell silent. Around us, the entire restaurant seemed to be holding its breath. Frank's words had summarized everything they'd been thinking, crystallized all their doubts into a single, devastating assessment. In their minds, I was either mentally ill, deliberately deceptive, or so desperate for attention that I'd invented an entire alternative version of my life. I sat there for a long moment, feeling the weight of their collective judgment pressing down on me. These were the people who were supposed to know me best, supposed to celebrate my achievements, supposed to be proud of the person I'd become. Instead, they'd chosen to believe that transformation was impossible, that people were static creatures incapable of fundamental growth. "You're wrong," I said, finally, standing up from the table. As I turned to leave, Frank's voice followed me. "Riley, sit down. Don't make a scene." But I was already walking away, past the staring faces, past the servers who stepped quickly aside, past my mother who reached out with a weak gesture that I ignored. Behind me, I could hear Frank's voice rising again, addressing the restaurant more than his table. "Sorry about that, folks. Family drama. You know how it is with kids these days. They all want to be heroes in their own story." The laughter that followed me out of the restaurant was the sound of a community choosing sides, and I wasn't on the winning team. Standing in the parking lot under the harsh glow of sodium lights, I fumbled for my phone with shaking hands. I needed to call someone who would understand, someone who knew the truth about what I'd done and who I'd become. As I scrolled through my contacts looking for Martinez or any of my former unit members, one thought kept repeating in my mind.
They wanted proof. Tomorrow, they were going to get more than they'd bargained for. I drove aimlessly through Millbrook's empty streets for nearly an hour, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The humiliation burned in my chest like acid, replaying Frank's mocking voice and the sound of that restaurant full of people laughing at my expense. Every turn brought me past familiar landmarks. The elementary school where I'd been too shy to speak up in class, the park where I'd hidden behind books instead of playing with other kids, the library where I'd spent countless afternoons avoiding the chaos of home life after my biological father's death. They were right about one thing. The girl who'd lived in this town had been quiet, scared, eager to please. She jumped at sudden noises, cried over dead animals, and backed down from any hint of confrontation. That version of me felt like a ghost now, someone I could barely remember being. But she was real enough in the minds of everyone who'd known me then. The problem was that trauma had a way of transforming people that civilians couldn't understand. The same sensitivity that made me cry over injured animals had evolved into an acute awareness of danger that kept my soldiers alive. The bookish nature that made me seem weak had taught me to study, to learn, to absorb tactical knowledge and leadership principles with an intensity that surprised my instructors. The fear that once paralyzed me had been channeled into a hypervigilance that served me well in combat zones. But how do you explain that kind of transformation to people who've never experienced it?
How do you make them understand that the military doesn't just teach you to fight, it rebuilds you from the ground up, strips away everything you think you know about your limitations, and reconstructs you into someone capable of things you never imagined? I finally pulled into the parking lot of the old Millbrook High School and sat there in the darkness, staring at the building where I'd graduated 6 years ago. The girl who'd walked across that stage to accept her diploma had been planning to attend community college, maybe study library science or elementary education. Safe, quiet careers that wouldn't require her to take risks or lead anyone. The idea that she would someday be responsible for the lives of other soldiers, that she would make split-second decisions under enemy fire, that she would earn commendations for courage under pressure, would have seemed like science fiction. My phone buzzed with a text from Martinez. "How's the homecoming going? Getting tired of people thanking you for your service yet?" I stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "They don't believe I served." The response came immediately. "What do you mean?" Over the next 20 minutes, I found myself pouring out the entire story through a series of increasingly frantic text messages. The months of skepticism, the casual dismissals, tonight's public humiliation. Martinez responded with a mix of profanity and disbelief that somehow made me feel less alone. "That's insane," she finally called to say. "You led more successful missions than half the male soldiers in our unit. You saved Henderson's life during that convoy attack. You coordinated medical evacuation under fire while most people would have been hiding behind the nearest rock." "They think I'm making it all up," I said, my voice sounding hollow even to myself. "They think I'm either delusional or deliberately lying about everything." "Then show them the proof. You've got your DD-214, your citation orders, photos from deployment. Hell, you've got half our unit's contact information. We'll all vouch for you." They said documents can be faked, that anyone can create false records with a computer these days. Martinez was quiet for a moment. "These people really think you're capable of orchestrating some elaborate stolen valor scam? The woman who insisted on using her real name for everything, who kept every receipt and documented every detail of every mission because you were paranoid about accountability." She was right about that. My attention to detail was legendary in our unit, sometimes to the point of annoyance. I'd kept meticulous records of everything: mission reports, equipment inventories, personnel evaluations, even personal photos and journals that documented my experiences. The idea that I would fabricate military service was absurd to anyone who actually knew me. But these people had decided they knew who I really was based on memories of a scared teenager. "Then you prove it to everyone else," Martinez said firmly. "You show the whole town exactly who you are and let them decide for themselves whether Frank Donovan knows what he's talking about." After we hung up, I sat in that parking lot for another hour, thinking about everything Martinez had said. The anger was still there, burning hot and bright, but underneath it was something else. A cold, tactical awareness that I recognized from deployment. The same mental state that had helped me plan successful missions under pressure. Frank and his friends had made this public. They'd chosen to humiliate me in front of the entire restaurant, to accuse me of stolen valor where everyone could hear. If they wanted a public confrontation, I could give them one. But it would be on my terms, with evidence they couldn't dismiss and witnesses they couldn't intimidate. I started making a mental inventory of everything I had. My DD-214 discharge papers, which detailed my length of service, military occupation, decorations, and combat deployments. The citation order for my Bronze Star, signed by my commanding officer and including specific details about the action that earned it. Photos from deployment. Not just the sanitized ones I'd shared with family, but the raw, unedited images that showed the reality of our missions. Contact information for every member of my unit, including officers who could verify my service record and enlisted soldiers who'd served under my command. But documents and photos could still be dismissed as elaborate fakes. What I needed was something that couldn't be fabricated or explained away. I needed witnesses who could testify to my character and service, people whose credentials were beyond question. That's when I remembered the reunion. 3 months ago, I'd received an invitation to the annual gathering of our unit. It was scheduled for next weekend in Nashville, just 3 hours away from Millbrook. 24 veterans would be there. soldiers I'd served with, officers I'd reported to, medics who'd patched us up after difficult missions, people who knew exactly who I was and what I'd done. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through the contact list from the reunion invitation. Most of them live scattered across the country now, but several were already planning to drive to Nashville for the event. A few had mentioned they might extend their trips, visit family, or take mini vacations in the area. What if they extended their trips a little further? What if they happened to find themselves in Millbrook on Veterans Day, when the whole town would be gathering for the annual parade and celebration? I started making calls. The first was to Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, my former squad leader. He was driving over from Atlanta with his wife and kids, planning to make a weekend of it in Nashville. When I explained the situation, his reaction was immediate and explosive. "They're calling you a fraud? Riley, you earned that Bronze Star by running into enemy fire to coordinate a medical evacuation. You spent 6 months training new soldiers because the officers trusted your judgment more than most sergeants with twice your experience. Anyone who questions your service can go to hell. Would you be willing to make a detour?" I asked, "just for a few hours? I know it's a lot to ask." "Text me the address," he said without hesitation. "We'll be there." The next call was to Lieutenant Sarah Chen, who'd been my platoon leader during my final deployment. She was flying in from Denver and had already planned to rent a car for the drive to Nashville. "This is outrageous," she said after I had explained. "You were one of the best soldiers I ever worked with. Professional, competent, unflappable under pressure. The fact that anyone would question your service record is insulting to everyone who served with you." "I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing. You're asking for backup, and that's what we do for each other, always." By midnight, I had commitments from 8 veterans to make the detour to Millbrook. By morning, word had spread through our informal network and the number had grown to 15. These weren't just enlisted soldiers. They included 2 officers, a military chaplain, and a medic who'd been present during the action that earned me my Bronze Star. As I finally drove home to my apartment above the hardware store, I felt something I hadn't experienced since return to Millbrook. Confidence. The scared girl who'd left this town 6 years ago was gone, and it was time for everyone to meet the woman who'd taken her place. Frank wanted proof that I was who I claimed to be. On Veterans Day, in front of the entire town, he was going to get it. The only question was whether he'd be able to handle the truth. The next 3 days passed in a blur of careful coordination and meticulous planning. I approached the situation with the same methodical precision I'd learned in military operations planning, identifying objectives, assessing resources, coordinating logistics, and preparing for contingencies. The anger was still there, burning hot and bright, but underneath it was something else, a cold, tactical awareness that I recognized from deployment. The same mental state that had helped me plan successful missions under pressure. My apartment had transformed into an improvised command center. I'd spread my military documents across the small dining table, organized chronologically, and cross-referenced with photos and mission reports. My laptop displayed multiple spreadsheets tracking the arrival times and contact information for the 15 veterans who'd committed to making the detour. A printed map of Millbrook was pinned to the wall, marked with the parade route, key locations, and the best staging areas for what I was privately calling Operation Reality Check.
The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using skills learned in the military to prove that I'd actually been in the military, but the situation called for strategic thinking rather than emotional responses. Frank and his friends had chosen to make this a public spectacle, and I intended to give them exactly what they'd asked for, just not in the way they expected. The logistics were more complex than I had initially anticipated. Veterans Day fell on a Saturday this year, which meant the Millbrook celebration would draw larger crowds than usual. The annual parade started at 10 in the morning, winding through downtown before ending at the courthouse square, where local veterans organizations hosted speeches and a small ceremony. Donovan's Bar and Grill traditionally stayed open throughout the festivities, serving as an unofficial gathering place for parade participants and spectators. My first challenge was timing. The veterans coming from out of state needed to coordinate their arrivals without drawing premature attention. Rodriguez was driving up from Atlanta with his family, planning to arrive Friday evening. Lieutenant Chen was flying into Nashville Thursday night and driving over Friday morning.
Staff Sergeant Williams was making the trip from North Carolina with 2 other unit members, turning it into an impromptu road trip. Each conversation with my former unit members had reinforced both my resolve and my growing appreciation for the bonds we'd forged during our service. These people were willing to drive hundreds of miles, rearrange family plans, and spend their own money to support someone they'd served with. It was the kind of loyalty and mutual support that civilians often struggle to understand. The military family that persisted long after active service ended. "You know what this reminds me of?" Rodriguez had said during one of our planning calls. "That time in Kandahar when Lieutenant Morrison questioned your tactical assessment and you had to prove you were right by walking him through the entire terrain analysis step by step." "Except this time the stakes are personal," I'd replied. "No," he'd corrected. "This time the stakes are about honor. Someone's questioning the integrity of one of our own, and that makes it all of our problem." The second challenge was documentation. I'd spent hours scanning and organizing evidence of my service, but I needed more than just papers. I needed the kind of proof that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. Working with Chen, who'd kept detailed unit records during our deployment, I compiled a comprehensive portfolio that included mission photos, official commendations, training certificates, and even letters of recommendation from commanding officers. The centerpiece was a detailed breakdown of the convoy operation that had earned me the Bronze Star. Chen had been my platoon leader during that mission and had written the initial recommendation for the commendation. Together, we reconstructed a timeline of events that included radio logs, after-action reports, and testimony from multiple witnesses. If Frank wanted details about my supposed fabricated heroics, I was prepared to provide them with the kind of specificity that only someone who'd actually been there could offer. Wednesday evening, I received an unexpected call from Captain David Park, who'd been our company commander during my final deployment. He was stationed at Fort Campbell now, less than 2 hours away, and had heard about the situation through our informal veteran network. "Sergeant Mitchum," he said, using my former rank in that crisp, professional tone I remembered well, "I understand you're having some issues with people questioning your service record." "Yes, sir. Family members mostly. They seem to think I've fabricated everything." "I see. Well, I have Saturday morning free, and I've been thinking it might be nice to visit Millbrook. I've heard they have an excellent Veterans Day celebration." The offer was both generous and strategically brilliant. Captain Park wasn't just any veteran. He was an active duty officer whose presence would lend official weight to our gathering. His uniform, his credentials, and his willingness to publicly vouch for my service would be difficult for anyone to dismiss. Thursday brought another unexpected development. Mrs. Henderson from the hardware store knocked on my apartment door with a concerned expression and a folded piece of paper. "Riley, honey, I hope you don't mind, but I couldn't help overhearing some of the phone calls you've been making about your military service." My heart sank. If Mrs. Henderson had been listening to my conversations and had started to doubt my story as well, the situation was even worse than I thought. "I want you to know," she continued, "that I never doubted you for a second. My late husband was a Korean War veteran, and he always said you could tell the real ones from the fakes just by how they talked about their service. You've got that look in your eyes, the one that says you've seen things you wished you hadn't." She handed me the paper, which turned out to be a printout of an email she'd sent to her nephew in Nashville to ask him to spread the word about Saturday's gathering to other veterans in the area. "I took the liberty of reaching out to some people," she said with a slight smile. "Word is getting around that there's going to be quite a gathering in Millbrook this weekend. Folks are interested."
By Friday morning, what had started as a small group of my former unit members had evolved into something larger. Veterans from across Tennessee and neighboring states had heard about the situation and were making plans to attend Millbrook's Veterans Day celebration. Some were curious about the drama. Others were outraged by the accusations of stolen valor, but all of them seemed to understand that this had become bigger than just my personal vindication. The Millbrook rumor mill had also started working overtime.
I'd received several phone calls from concerned townspeople who'd heard conflicting stories about what had happened at the bar. Some had heard that I'd been exposed as a fraud. Others had heard that I was bringing in outside agitators to cause trouble. The truth, as usual, was more complicated than either narrative suggested. Friday afternoon, I made my final reconnaissance trip to downtown Millbrook. The parade preparations were well underway. Barriers being set up along Main Street, sound equipment being tested at the courthouse square, and vendors arranging their booths for the post-parade festival. Donovan's Bar and Grill had hung additional patriotic decorations and posted signs advertising their Veterans Day specials. I stood across the street from the bar, studying the layout and timing my approach for maximum impact. The parade would end at the courthouse square around 11:30, and most participants would likely head to the bar for lunch and drinks. That would be the perfect time for my unit to make their appearance when the crowd was largest and the atmosphere was most festive. As I walked back to my car, I passed Frank coming out of the hardware store. He saw me and paused, his expression shifting from surprise to something that might have been uncertainty. "Riley," he said carefully, "heard you've been making some phone calls. Planning something for tomorrow?" "Just attending the Veterans Day celebration, same as everyone else." "Look," he said, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard, "about the other night at the bar. Maybe things got a little heated. You know how it is when people start drinking and talking." It was as close to an apology as I was likely to get from Frank, and part of me was tempted to accept it and let the whole situation fade away. But the damage had already been done. The accusation of stolen valor had been made publicly, and it couldn't be taken back with a casual conversation in a parking lot. "I understand," I said. "Tomorrow should clear everything up." As I drove home, I thought about how different this confrontation felt from the emotional chaos of Thursday night. I wasn't the hurt, confused daughter anymore, desperately trying to make my family understand. I was a veteran preparing for a mission, and I had all the resources I needed to complete it successfully. That evening, Rodriguez called to confirm his arrival time. "We'll be there at 0900 hours, he slipped into military time out of habit, 15 strong and ready to show Millbrook what real soldiers look like. "Thanks for doing this," I said, "all of you. It means more than I can express. That's what family does. And Riley, tomorrow's going to be a good day." As I went to sleep Friday night, I felt calmer than I had since returning to Millbrook. Tomorrow would bring resolution, one way or another. The scared girl who'd left for basic training 6 years ago was gone, and it was time for everyone to meet the woman who'd taken her place. Saturday morning arrived crisp and clear, with the kind of blue sky perfection that made Veterans Day parades feel like Norman Rockwell paintings. I woke before dawn, not from anxiety, but from the ingrained habit of early military schedules. My apartment felt different, charged with anticipation rather than the heavy dread that had characterized my previous weeks in Millbrook. At 800 hours, my phone buzzed with the first status update. Rodriguez texting from the parking lot of the Comfort Inn. "Alpha team in position. Weather's perfect. Ready when you are." 20 minutes later, Lieutenant Chen checked in from the gas station on Route 9. Bravo team fueled and moving, ETA 15 minutes to downtown staging area. I dressed carefully in civilian clothes. Dark jeans, a navy blue blazer, and the small American flag pin that I'd worn to every official military function. No uniform, no obvious military identifiers. Today wasn't about flaunting credentials. It was about revealing truth through presence and testimony. The Millbrook Veterans Day Parade was already drawing crowds by the time I reached downtown. Families lined Main Street with folding chairs and coffee cups, children waved miniature flags, and the high school marching band tuned their instruments near the starting point. The atmosphere was festive and patriotic, exactly the kind of small-town celebration that should have felt welcoming to a returning veteran. I positioned myself near Bryson's Diner, which offered a clear view of both the parade route and Donovan's Bar and Grill across the street. Frank and Diane were visible through the restaurant's large windows, preparing for what would undoubtedly be their busiest day of the year. Jesse worked the outdoor grill they'd set up for the festival, flipping burgers and hot dogs for the growing crowd of early arrivals.
At 0845, I spotted the first familiar face. Sergeant Rodriguez emerged from a black SUV with Tennessee plates, followed by his wife Carmen and their 2 young children. He wore civilian clothes but carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a career soldier.
Straight spine, alert eyes, controlled movements. Behind him came 2 more vehicles carrying the rest of his group. They didn't approach me immediately. Instead, they dispersed into the crowd like a well-executed reconnaissance operation, some heading toward the parade staging area, others finding positions along the route. To casual observers, they looked like any other military families attending a Veterans Day celebration. But I could see the tactical awareness in how they positioned themselves, the subtle communication signals they used, the way they maintained visual contact with each other while appearing to focus on the festivities. At 0900, Lieutenant Chen arrived with her contingent. Captain Park pulled up in a rental car precisely at 0915, wearing his dress uniform and looking every inch the professional officer he was. The sight of him in full military regalia drew respectful nods from passing veterans and curious stares from civilians who recognized the significance of his rank insignia. The parade began promptly at 10,000 hours. Local veterans organizations led the procession. Korean War survivors in a decorated pickup truck, Vietnam veterans carrying their unit flags, Gulf War soldiers marching in loose formation. The high school band followed, playing patriotic marches with enthusiastic, if imperfect, precision. Behind them came the Boy Scouts, the Volunteer Fire Department, and various civic organizations. As the parade wound through downtown Millbrook, I noticed my former unit members seamlessly integrating with the crowd. Rodriguez's children cheered and waved flags like any other kids at the parade. Chen stood with a group of other women, applauding politely as each unit passed. Captain Park positioned himself near the VFW veterans, his uniform drawing them into conversation about his service record and current assignment. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. What had been a typical small-town parade was gradually becoming something more significant. Veterans in the crowd began recognizing Captain Park's rank and engaging him in discussions about current military operations. Word spread quietly through the veteran community that there were several active duty and recently discharged soldiers in attendance here to support a local veteran who'd been facing some difficulties. By the time the parade concluded at the courthouse square, the dynamic had shifted noticeably. The usual post-parade migration toward Donovan's Bar and Grill included not just local residents, but my entire unit, moving with the crowd but maintaining their tactical cohesion. They weren't creating a disturbance or drawing undue attention. They were simply present, visible, and undeniably authentic. I waited until the crowd had settled into their lunch routines before making my move. At 11:30 hours, I walked across Main Street toward the bar, my unit falling into loose formation around me. Not threatening, not aggressive, just there. 15 veterans surrounding one of their own as she approached the establishment where her service had been questioned. The first person to notice was Jesse, who looked up from his grill to see me approaching with what appeared to be a small army of supporters. His expression shifted from confusion to alarm as he recognized the professional bearing and coordinated movement of the group. These weren't random townspeople or curious tourists. These were clearly military personnel, and they were clearly there for me. Frank emerged from the bar just as we reached the outdoor seating area. His face went through several rapid changes of expression: surprise, confusion, and then growing realization as he took in the sight of Captain Park's uniform, the tactical coordination of the group, and the fact that I was at the center of it all. "Riley," he said carefully, his voice carrying across the suddenly quieter patio. "What's this about?" Before I could answer, Captain Park stepped forward and introduced himself with the crisp professionalism that marked career officers. "Good afternoon. I'm Captain David Park, 101st Airborne Division. I understand there's been some confusion about Sergeant Mitchum's service record." The word sergeant hung in the air like a challenge. Frank's eyes darted between Captain Park's uniform, the assembled veterans, and my calm expression. Around us, conversations had stopped, as other patrons recognized that something significant was happening. "I never said she didn't serve," Frank attempted weakly. "I just thought—"
"You thought what?" Staff Sergeant Williams had arrived and positioned himself so that Frank was effectively surrounded by veterans. That she was making up her combat deployments? That she forged her military records? That she convinced 15 of us to drive hundreds of miles to support a lie? The tactical situation was perfect. My unit had executed a textbook encirclement operation, using the crowd and the public setting to their advantage while maintaining absolute professionalism. Frank couldn't retreat without looking cowardly, couldn't escalate without appearing to attack veterans on Veterans Day, and couldn't continue his accusations without directly challenging the credibility of multiple active duty and former military personnel. Captain Park opened his service portfolio and began reading from my official records in the clear, authoritative voice of someone delivering a briefing. Sergeant Riley Mitchum, Military Police Corps. 3 deployments to Afghanistan. Bronze Star with V device for valor. Army Commendation Medal. Afghanistan Campaign Medal with 3 campaign stars. Each award, each deployment, each commendation was documented with official orders and witness statements. The crowd listened in stunned silence as the full scope of my military career was laid out in precise, undeniable detail. This wasn't the modest service record Frank had been willing to acknowledge. This was the resume of a decorated combat veteran who'd earned her rank and recognition through actual performance under fire. By the time Captain Park finished reading, the patio of Donovan's Bar and Grill had become an impromptu military ceremony. Veterans in the crowd had removed their hats, civilians stood respectfully, and even the skeptical VFW members who'd participated in Thursday night's mockery were looking uncomfortable with their previous assumptions. Frank stood in the center of it all, his face red with embarrassment and growing anger, realizing that his public challenge to my credibility had backfired spectacularly. The quiet stepdaughter he thought he knew had just demonstrated that she commanded the respect and loyalty of career soldiers, including officers who outranked anyone he'd ever met. Now, Captain Park concluded, closing the folder and looking directly at Frank, I believe there was some question about the authenticity of Sergeant Mitchum's service record. Would you care to repeat those concerns in the presence of her chain of command? The silence that followed was absolute. Frank had been given the opportunity to double down on his accusations, to maintain his position in front of the entire town. But, faced with the assembled evidence and the professional testimony of multiple veterans, his confidence had completely evaporated. The confrontation he'd started with cruel laughter and public mockery was ending with his complete and public humiliation, witnessed by everyone who'd heard his original accusations. And we weren't done yet. Frank's face had gone from red to an alarming shade of purple, and I could see the moment when his embarrassment crystallized into desperate anger. Being publicly contradicted was one thing, but being systematically dismantled in front of his own customers in his own establishment on the busiest day of the year was more than his ego could tolerate. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising above the murmur of the crowd. "You people don't know Riley like we do. We raised her. We know what she was like before she left. And this whole," he gestured wildly at my assembled unit, "this whole production doesn't change that." Captain Park's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that I recognized from deployment briefings when someone had just said something monumentally stupid. "Are you saying that these official military records are falsified?" Park asked, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made even seasoned sergeants stand straighter. "I'm saying that people can change their stories, get their friends to back them up, make things sound more dramatic than they really were." Frank shot back, his desperation making him reckless. "Maybe she was in the military, fine, but all this hero stuff, all these medals and combat stories, that's not the girl we knew." The crowd around the patio had grown significantly. Word was spreading through the Veterans Day festival that something major was happening at Donovan's Bar and Grill. Local veterans who'd participated in the parade were arriving drawn by rumors of a confrontation involving active duty soldiers. Families with children pressed closer, sensing drama but not understanding its significance. Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension with parade ground precision. "Sir, are you calling me a liar?" The directness of the question caught Frank off guard. "I'm not calling anyone." "Because that's what you just did," Rodriguez continued relentlessly. "You said she got her friends to back up false stories. I'm one of those friends. So either you believe I'm lying about combat operations I personally witnessed,
or you need to reconsider your position." Jesse had abandoned his grill and moved closer to his father, his face twisted with the same desperate anger. "This is harassment," he announced loudly. "Coming here with all these people trying to intimidate us because we dared to question her stories?" Staff Sergeant Williams, a mountain of a man who'd served 2 tours in Iraq before transferring to our unit, turned his attention to Jesse with the kind of look that probably terrified new recruits. "Son, nobody's intimidating anyone. We're here to set the straight record about a fellow soldier's service record, unless you've got something against veterans supporting each other."
"I've got something against liars," Jesse shot back, emboldened by his father's defiance. "And I've got something against people who fake being heroes for attention." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Several local veterans audibly gasped, and I saw genuine anger flicker across multiple faces. Accusing someone of stolen valor was serious enough, but doing it on Veterans Day, in front of actual combat veterans, was approaching sacrilege. Lieutenant Chen opened a second folder and began laying photos on one of the outdoor tables. "These are mission photographs from Sergeant Mitchum's deployment," she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent patio. "Official documentation of combat operations she led or participated in." The photos told a story that no amount of skepticism could dismiss. There I was in full combat gear, coordinating with Afghan National Police at a forward operating base. Another showed me briefing a mixed unit of American and coalition forces before a patrol. A third captured the aftermath of the convoy attack that earned my Bronze Star. Smoke, damaged vehicles, and medics working frantically while I coordinated defensive positions. "This is photographic evidence of Sergeant Mitchum in combat zones, leading soldiers, making tactical decisions under enemy fire," Chen continued methodically. "Are you suggesting these are also fabricated?" Frank stared at the photos, his confidence visibly cracking. These weren't casual snapshots or staged publicity shots. They were raw, unfiltered images of military operations that couldn't be faked or staged. The tactical equipment, the terrain, the expressions of stress and determination on soldiers' faces all spoke to their authenticity. But rather than backing down, Frank doubled down with the desperation of someone whose entire worldview was collapsing. "Photos can be doctored, documents can be forged. Hell, for all I know, you people are all actors she hired to make this whole show more convincing." The suggestion that 15 veterans, including an active duty officer in uniform, were part of some elaborate deception was so absurd that several people in the crowd actually laughed. But it was bitter laughter, the kind that comes when someone has pushed a situation past the point of reason. Captain Park pulled out his military identification and badge, holding them where the crowd could see. "Sir, are you suggesting that I'm impersonating an officer? Because that's a federal crime, and I'd be happy to call the military police to verify my identity and authority." The offer to involve official law enforcement shifted the dynamic again. Frank was no longer just questioning my credibility, he was edging toward accusations that would involve federal investigators if he continued down this path. Diane had been silent throughout the confrontation, standing behind the bar and watching her husband destroy his own credibility in real time. Finally, she stepped forward, her voice shaky but audible. "Frank, maybe we should—" "Stay out of this, Diane," he snapped, his anger now targeting everyone around him. "These people think they can come into our place, embarrass us in front of our customers, make us look like fools because we dared to question their precious war hero?" "Nobody's trying to embarrass anyone," I said, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. My voice was calm, controlled, carrying the authority I'd learned from leading soldiers under pressure. "Truth," Frank's laugh was harsh and bitter, "the truth is that you were a scared little girl who couldn't handle confrontation, who cried when we had to discipline you, who ran away to the military because you couldn't deal with real life, and now you want us to believe you turned into some kind of warrior princess?"
The personal attack crossed a line that even his previous accusations hadn't approached. This wasn't about military records anymore. This was about character assassination, about attempting to destroy my credibility by attacking my past vulnerabilities. Rodriguez's response was immediate and ice cold. "Sir, you need to stop talking right now." "Or what?" Frank challenged, sensing that he'd found a new angle of attack. "You're going to threaten me on my own property in front of witnesses?" "No threats necessary," Captain Park interjected, his voice carrying the finality of someone accustomed to ending disputes with authority rather than force. "But I think this conversation has revealed everything the community needs to know about the character of the people involved." He was right. The crowd that had gathered wasn't just watching a family dispute anymore. They were witnessing a character study. On one side stood 15 veterans who'd driven hundreds of miles to support a fellow soldier, presenting documented evidence and maintaining professional composure even under personal attack. On the other side stood a man whose response to overwhelming evidence was to escalate accusations, attack character, and question the integrity of multiple military personnel. The optics couldn't have been worse for Frank. Veterans Day, a crowd full of military families, documented proof of service, and his increasingly desperate attempts to maintain an untenable position. Every word he spoke was digging the hole deeper. But Frank was past the point of rational calculation. The public humiliation, the professional rebuke from actual military officers, and the gradual realization that he'd been catastrophically wrong about everything had pushed him into a kind of emotional freefall.
"Fine," he said, his voice carrying across the silent patio. "Maybe she did serve. Maybe she even did some of the things you're claiming. But that doesn't change the fact that she's not the person we raised. She came back here expecting us to treat her like some kind of hero, like she was better than the rest of us because she played soldier for a few years." The phrase "played soldier" landed like a grenade among the assembled veterans. The collective intake of breath was audible, and I saw several hands clench into fists. Frank had just insulted not only my service, but the service of everyone standing around him. Staff Sergeant Martinez stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. "Did you just say she played soldier?" Frank realized his mistake immediately, but it was too late to take back the words. He'd crossed from questioning individual credibility to insulting military service in general, and he'd done it in front of people who'd sacrificed years of their lives in service to their country. The battle was no longer about my service record. It had become about respect for military service itself, and Frank had just positioned himself as the enemy of everyone who'd ever worn a uniform. The silence that followed was pregnant with consequences, and I knew that what happened next would determine not just the outcome of this confrontation, but Frank's standing in the community for years to come. The transformation in the crowd was immediate and decisive. Frank's careless dismissal of military service as playing soldier had crossed a line that even his most sympathetic supporters couldn't defend. The local VFW members who'd been quietly backing him throughout the confrontation visibly recoiled. Bill Hendricks, the Vietnam veteran who'd questioned my service just days earlier, shook his head with disgust and walked away from Frank's side of the patio. "You need to apologize," said Tom Bradley, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd lost friends in combat. "Right now, to all of us." Frank looked around desperately, finally realizing that his support had evaporated completely. Even his regular customers were staring at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright anger. The Veterans Day crowd included multiple military families, and his casual insult to their service had turned his own establishment into hostile territory. "I didn't mean," Frank began, but Captain Park cut him off with the kind of command presence that decades of military service had perfected. "Mr. Donovan, you've made your position clear.
You've questioned the integrity of documented military service, suggested that multiple veterans are participating in an elaborate deception, and dismissed combat deployment as playing soldier. I think this conversation is concluded. Diane stepped forward, her face pale and her hands shaking. For the first time since the confrontation began, she looked directly at me, instead of trying to avoid eye contact. Riley, I'm sorry. We were wrong. About everything. The apology hung in the air, sincere but insufficient. 6 months of skepticism, weeks of dismissive comments, and Thursday night's public humiliation couldn't be erased with a few words. But it was acknowledgement, which was more than Frank seemed capable of offering. Jesse had gone silent, his earlier bravado completely deflated. The young man who'd sneered about participation trophies and fake heroes was now surrounded by actual veterans who'd served in multiple conflicts. His position as the family contrarian had become untenable when the family was clearly, demonstrably wrong. Rodriguez approached Frank with the measured steps of someone who'd learned to control his temper under much more challenging circumstances. Sir, I served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. Staff Sergeant Williams here did 3 deployments to combat zones. Lieutenant Chen coordinated logistics for operations that saved hundreds of lives. Captain Park has commanded soldiers in active combat operations. He paused, letting the weight of those credentials settle over the crowd before continuing. Every single person here has earned the right to wear the uniform through service, sacrifice, and commitment that you clearly don't understand. Your stepdaughter has served with honor alongside all of us, and questioning her integrity is questioning ours. The systematic dismantling was methodical and devastating. Frank had positioned himself not just against me, but against a wall of military credibility that couldn't be argued away or dismissed. His accusations required him to believe that 15 veterans, including active duty officers, had conspired to fabricate evidence and commit federal crimes just to support someone's lies about military service. Captain Park opened his phone and began scrolling through contacts. Mr. Donovan, since you've questioned the authenticity of our military credentials, I'm going to call the base commander at Fort Campbell. Colonel Martinez can verify my identity and authority, and, if you'd like, we can arrange for military police to examine all of our documentation. The offer to involve official military law enforcement was the final nail in Frank's credibility. He could continue his accusations, but doing so would trigger a federal investigation that would either vindicate us completely or expose us as criminals. There was no middle ground, no face-saving compromise available. That won't be necessary, Frank said quickly, his voice deflated. I believe you're who you say you are. And do you believe Sergeant Mitchum is who we say she is? Captain Park pressed relentlessly.
Frank looked around the patio one more time, seeing his customers, his neighbors, and his community staring back at him with expressions that ranged from disappointment to disgust. His business reputation, his social standing, and his credibility as a local leader had been destroyed in the span of 30 minutes. Yes, he said finally, I believe she served. But the concession was too little, too late. The damage had been done not just to my reputation, which was now fully restored, but to his own standing in the community. The man who'd built his business on being a gathering place for local veterans had publicly insulted military service on Veterans Day in front of actual combat veterans. Lieutenant Chen began collecting the photos and documents from the table, her movements crisp and professional. Sergeant Mitchum's service record speaks for itself, she announced to the crowd. 3 deployments, multiple commendations, leadership positions, and the respect of everyone she served with. Anyone who wants to examine her documentation is welcome to do so. Several local veterans approached the table, not because they doubted the evidence, but because they wanted to show support. Mrs. Patterson, from the post office, whose son had served in Iraq, studied my Bronze Star citation with tears in her eyes. Mr. Henderson, from the hardware store, read through my deployment records and shook his head with what appeared to be shame at his earlier skepticism. The tide of public opinion hadn't just turned, it had become a tsunami.
Social media posts were already appearing as people documented the confrontation with photos and videos. The story spreading through Millbrook wasn't about a family dispute anymore. It was about a decorated veteran being vindicated after facing false accusations of stolen valor. Word was also spreading to the broader veteran community. Several attendees were texting friends and posting updates to veteran Facebook groups, describing the systematic defense of a fellow soldier's honor. By evening, the story would reach veterans across the state and beyond, cementing my reputation while destroying Frank's credibility within the military community. Frank retreated toward the bar entrance, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The man who'd confidently challenged my service just hours earlier now looked smaller, diminished by the weight of his public humiliation. His customers were already leaving, many stopping to shake hands with my unit members and express their support for my service. Jesse followed his father inside without making eye contact with anyone. The young man who'd accused me of seeking unearned attention had learned a hard lesson about the difference between skepticism and slander. His casual dismissal of military service had been exposed as ignorant at best, malicious at worst. Staff Sergeant Martinez approached me as the crowd began to disperse. "How are you holding up, Sergeant?" "Better than I expected, honestly." "Thank you, all of you. This means more than I can express." "This is what we do," he said simply. "Nobody questions one of our own without dealing with all of us." Captain Park was the last to approach, his expression thoughtful as he watched Frank disappear into his bar. "Sergeant Mitchum, I want you to know that your service record is exemplary. Anyone who served with you knows your value as a soldier and as a person. Don't let anyone make you doubt that again." "I won't, sir." And I meant it. As my unit prepared to continue their journey to Nashville for the reunion, the cleanup from the confrontation began. Diane emerged from the bar and began apologizing to departing customers, trying to salvage what she could of the business relationships that Frank had damaged. The Veterans Day celebration continued around town, but Donovan's Bar and Grill was no longer the center of the festivities. Several local veterans made a point of stopping by my position before leaving, offering handshakes, words of support, and invitations to join their organizations. The community that had been skeptical of my service just hours earlier was now embracing me as one of their own, and the contrast couldn't have been more striking. Mrs. Henderson approached as I was saying goodbye to Rodriguez and his family. "Riley, honey," she said, "I want you to know that not everyone doubted you. Some of us could see the truth from the beginning." "Thank you," I said. "That means a lot. And I want you to know that there's going to be a lot of people looking to make amends for how you were treated. This town knows how to honor its veterans when we're reminded what that means." As the crowd dispersed and my unit members began their journey to Nashville, I stood in the courthouse square where the Veterans Day ceremony had concluded just hours earlier. The contrast between the morning's uncertainty and the afternoon's vindication was almost overwhelming. Frank had questioned whether I was the person they'd raised, and, in a way, he'd been right. The scared girl who'd left Millbrook 6 years ago was gone, replaced by a woman who'd earned her place among warriors through service, sacrifice, and commitment. The transformation he'd found so hard to believe had been proven beyond any doubt. But the victory felt different than I had expected. There was satisfaction, certainly, and relief that the truth had finally been recognized. But there was also sadness for the relationships that had been damaged, the family bonds that might never fully heal, and the man who'd destroyed his own credibility rather than admit he'd been wrong.
As I walked back toward my apartment, I passed Donovan's Bar and Grill one final time. Through the windows, I could see Frank sitting alone at the bar, a drink in his hand and defeat written across his shoulders. The man who'd built his reputation on supporting veterans had learned too late what it meant to attack one. The battle was over. Justice had been served. And for the first time since returning to Millbrook, I felt like I was truly home. 3 months had passed since Veterans Day, and Millbrook had settled into a new normal that looked very different from the one I'd returned to 6 months earlier. The story of the confrontation at Donovan's Bar and Grill had become local legend, but not in the way Frank had intended when he first questioned my service. Instead of being remembered as the man who exposed a fraud, he'd become known as the person who publicly attacked a decorated veteran on Veterans Day and suffered the consequences. The changes were visible everywhere I looked. Donovan's Bar and Grill had lost most of its veteran clientele, who'd migrated to Murphy's Tavern across town, where the owner actually respected military service. Frank's business had recovered somewhat with non-veteran customers, but the damage to his reputation within the military community was permanent. The VFW had quietly removed him from their membership roster, and his invitation to speak at Memorial Day events had been permanently rescinded. Jesse had left town 2 weeks after the confrontation, enrolling in a community college in Knoxville where nobody knew about his family's humiliation. Before leaving, he'd stopped by my apartment to offer an awkward apology that felt more about his own guilt than genuine remorse, but it was something. Diane had made several attempts to rebuild our relationship, but the foundation of trust had been so thoroughly damaged that our interactions remained polite but distant. My own life had transformed in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The veteran community that had rallied to my defense on Veterans Day had welcomed me with open arms, offering job opportunities, social connections, and the kind of brotherhood I'd missed since leaving active duty. Within a month, I'd been offered a position with a veteran-owned security consulting firm based in Nashville, work that utilized my military experience and paid significantly better than anything available locally. Mrs. Henderson had insisted I stay in the apartment above her hardware store rent-free until I was ready to move, calling it the least the town could do for someone who served with such distinction. The gesture was generous, but more importantly, it represented the complete reversal in how the community viewed me. The quiet girl they'd once dismissed had become someone worthy of respect and support. The broader impact had reached far beyond Millbrook's borders. Video footage of the confrontation had gone viral in veteran communities across social media, becoming a symbol of how civilians sometimes failed to understand or appreciate military service. I'd received messages of support from veterans across the country, many sharing their own stories of having their service questioned by family members or community members who couldn't reconcile the person they'd known with the soldier they'd become. One message had particularly resonated with me, from a female Marine who'd faced similar skepticism after returning from deployment. People think they know who you are based on who you were before the military changed you. They can't understand that transformation isn't betrayal, it's growth. You didn't stop being yourself, you became the best version of yourself. That insight had helped me process the complicated emotions surrounding Frank's rejection of my military identity. His inability to accept my transformation wasn't really about my credibility. It was about his own limitations, his inability to conceive that people could fundamentally change through challenging experiences. The scared girl, he remembered, hadn't been erased by military service. She'd been forged into something stronger, more confident, more capable. The professional opportunities that emerged from my vindication had been unexpected, but welcome. Captain Park had recommended me for a position with a defense contractor that worked with transitioning veterans, helping them translate military skills into civilian careers. The irony wasn't lost on me that my experience being questioned about my service had qualified me to help other veterans facing similar challenges. Lieutenant Chen had stayed in touch, and through her connections, I'd been invited to speak at veteran transition workshops about the importance of documentation and community support. My story had become a case study in how veterans could advocate for themselves and each other when facing skepticism or discrimination. The healing process hadn't been linear or simple. There were still nights when I replayed Frank's accusations, still moments when I questioned whether I'd handled the situation correctly. The nuclear option of bringing my entire unit to Millbrook had been effective, but it had also been devastating for relationships that might have been salvaged through gentler approaches. Dr. Sarah Kim, the veteran counselor I'd started seeing in Nashville, had helped me understand that my response had been proportional to the attack on my credibility. She'd explained during one of our sessions, "You didn't escalate unnecessarily. You responded to a public challenge with public proof. The fact that the proof was overwhelming isn't your fault. It's evidence that their accusations were baseless."
The therapy had also helped me process the grief that came with accepting that some family relationships might never recover. Frank's pride wouldn't allow him to fully acknowledge how wrong he'd been, and my own self-respect wouldn't allow me to pretend the damage hadn't occurred. We existed in a state of cold civility when our paths crossed, but the warmth that had once defined our relationship was gone, permanently. Diane's attempts at reconciliation had been more successful, though our relationship remained strained. She'd begun attending veteran family support groups, trying to understand how military service changed people and how families could better support returning soldiers. The effort was genuine, but it felt like too little, too late. Still, it was progress. The most significant change had been internal. The 6 months of doubt and self-questioning that preceded Veterans Day had forced me to examine my own identity in ways I'd never considered. Military service had indeed transformed me, but the transformation hadn't erased my essential self. It had revealed capabilities and strengths that had always existed but had never been tested. The scared girl Frank remembered had possessed courage. She'd just never been in situations that required her to demonstrate it. The bookish teenager who'd avoided confrontation had possessed strategic thinking skills. She'd just never been trained to apply them tactically. The quiet daughter who'd seemed weak had possessed leadership potential. She'd just never been given soldiers to lead. Military service hadn't created those qualities. It had identified, developed, and channeled them into something powerful and purposeful. The person I'd become wasn't a betrayal of who I'd been. It was the fulfillment of who I'd always had the potential to become. Standing in my Nashville office 6 months later, looking out at the city skyline while reviewing resumes of veterans seeking career transitions, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. The girl who'd returned to Millbrook seeking acceptance and understanding had found something better: self-respect, professional purpose, and a community that valued her contributions. Frank's rejection had been painful, but it had also been liberating. It had forced me to stop seeking validation from people who were determined not to give it to me, and to start building relationships with people who understood and appreciated who I'd become. The family I'd been born into had failed to recognize my growth, but the family I'd chosen through military service had stood by me when it mattered most. The story had become something larger than personal vindication. It had become a reminder that veterans deserve respect and recognition for their service, that families need to support rather than question their returning soldiers, and that communities have a responsibility to honor the sacrifices made on their behalf. Sometimes the people who raise you can't see who you've become because they're too invested in who you used to be. Sometimes growth requires leaving behind the limitations that others want to place on you. And sometimes the family you choose is more loyal than the family you're born into. Have you ever had to prove yourself to people who should have believed in you from the beginning? Have you ever outgrown the version of yourself that others wanted to keep you as? Drop a comment and share your story, because transformation is something we all face, and supporting each other through it is how we build real community. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more stories about courage, growth, and standing up for yourself when it matters most. Because here, we believe that you have the right to become the person you're meant to be, regardless of who others think you should remain. Stay strong, stay true to yourself, and never apologize for growing into someone worthy of respect. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.